Before sunrise, two farmers wake up on opposite sides of the world. One is in the American Midwest. He walks past machines worth more than some families will earn in a lifetime. His fields stretch toward the horizon. His country has roads, storage systems, research institutions, crop insurance, financial markets, and some of the most advanced agricultural technology ever developed. But this farmer is worried. He watches export markets. He watches trade disputes. He watches the price of fuel, fertilizer, machinery, and transportation. And he knows something that many people forget. Even the strongest agricultural system in the world can feel pressure when international trade becomes uncertain. Now travel thousands of miles away. The second farmer stands in Burkina Faso. His field is smaller. His equipment is simpler. His access to capital is more limited. The road to market may be harder. The risks are different. But this farmer is looking at his land in a new way, not only as a place to grow food, not only as a place to survive, but possibly as part of an energy system, a source of industrial value, a source of jobs, and perhaps one day a source of greater national independence. That is what makes the reported discussion around a multi-billion-dollar United States-linked biofuel proposal so important. The question is not simply whether Burkina Faso needs money. Of course, it needs investment. Every developing economy does. The deeper question is what happens after the money arrives? Who owns the technology? Who controls the processing? Who decides where the fuel goes? Who trains the engineers? Who earns the largest share of the final value? And when the project is finished, does Burkina Faso become more independent? Or does it remain dependent in a different form? That is the real story. America is trying to protect its farmers. Burkina Faso is trying to transform its farmers. And somewhere between those two realities lies a much larger question about the future of Africa. If this kind of economic transformation matters to you, subscribe to the channel for more calm, detailed analysis of Burkina Faso, African development, energy security, and the changing global economy. Because before this story is over, we must answer one difficult question. Could saying no to outside money actually become the first step toward economic freedom? For generations, many African economies have faced a familiar pattern. Raw materials leave the continent. Finished products return. Cotton leaves. Minerals leave. Agricultural commodities leave. But the greater share of processing, technology, branding, financing, and industrial value often happens somewhere else. The problem is not trade itself. Trade can create prosperity. The problem begins when a country remains trapped at the lowest value end of the chain. Imagine a farmer in Burkina Faso. He grows a crop. He works through heat uncertain rainfall, transportation problems, and limited access to machinery. At harvest time, the crop leaves his farm. Perhaps it is sold cheaply. Perhaps it travels hundreds or thousands of miles. Perhaps somewhere else it is processed into a higher value product. The farmer did the first hard work, but much of the final value was created after the crop left his hands. Now imagine changing that chain. The crop still begins on the farm, but instead of leaving immediately, it enters a local processing facility. Local workers move it. Local technicians inspect it. Local engineers operate the equipment. Local companies maintain the machinery. The processed product becomes fuel. That fuel can support transportation. It can support agriculture. It can support industry. And more of the value remains inside the country. The chain becomes simple enough for anyone to understand. Farm, processing, fuel, transport, jobs, national value. This is why biofuel can become more than an environmental story. It can become an industrial story. And for Burkina Faso, that distinction matters. A farmer in a rural community may never use the words economic sovereignty. He may never speak about global supply chains. He may never talk about geopolitical competition. His questions are more practical. Can I afford fuel for the next season? Can I irrigate my land? Can I move my harvest to market? Can I earn enough to repair my equipment? Can my children find work near home? Or will they have to leave? These questions are not theoretical. They are the difference between an economy that produces raw materials and an economy that begins creating more value around those materials. But there is another question. Suppose Burkina Faso receives foreign financing for a biofuel industry. Suppose the money pays for facilities. Suppose the equipment arrives. Suppose production begins. But foreign companies control the technology. Foreign contractors manage the most valuable systems. Foreign suppliers provide the replacement parts. Foreign lenders shape the financial terms. And local farmers remain only suppliers of raw material. Would that be energy sovereignty? Or would it be dependence with newer machines? This is where the debate becomes more complicated. Foreign investment is not automatically bad. International partnerships are not automatically dangerous. Burkina Faso cannot build every industrial system alone. No modern economy can. The issue is not whether foreigners participate. The issue is whether Africans become owners, engineers, managers, manufacturers, and decision makers inside the system. That difference could determine whether a biofuel project creates temporary activity or long-term industrial capacity. And this is where the comparison with the United States becomes fascinating. The American farmer begins from an entirely different position. He works inside a mature agricultural economy. His country has built layers of support around farming over generations. Research universities, agricultural science, large transport networks, processing industries, commodity markets, financial services, machinery manufacturers, energy systems, export infrastructure. The farmer is not simply producing crops. He is part of a vast economic machine. But that machine is not immune to pressure. When trade relations become tense, agricultural markets can be disrupted. When foreign buyers change suppliers, farmers notice. When tariffs affect international commerce, uncertainty can spread through rural communities. When input costs rise, profits can narrow. And when markets become unstable, governments face pressure to protect domestic producers. This does not mean American agriculture is collapsing. That would be an exaggeration. The United States remains one of the most powerful agricultural economies in the world. But strength does not mean freedom from vulnerability. In fact, the larger and more connected an agricultural system becomes, the more exposed it can be to changes in global trade. Now compare that with Burkina Faso. The challenge there is almost the reverse. The Burkinabe farmer is not mainly asking how to protect a mature system. He is asking how to build one. He needs better roads, more reliable energy, more irrigation, more storage, more processing, more machinery, more technical knowledge, and more markets. The American farmer asks, how do I protect what my family built? The African farmer asks, how do we finally build what our families never had? That is not a contest between good and bad. It is a contrast between two stages of economic development. One system is defending enormous existing capacity. The other is trying to create capacity that has been missing for generations. And this is why the biofuel question becomes so powerful. If Burkina Faso can connect agriculture to domestic energy production, then farmland may become more than farmland. It becomes infrastructure. It becomes industrial input. It becomes part of national energy security. Think about what that could mean for a young engineer in Ouagadougou or Bobo Dioulasso. He has studied mechanics, energy systems, chemistry, or industrial technology. In the old model, his country may export raw material while importing finished fuel. His education gives him knowledge, but the industrial jobs he needs may exist somewhere else. Now imagine a different model. Processing plants operate inside Burkina Faso. Technicians are trained locally. Maintenance teams are created. Laboratories are built. Transport companies expand. Farmers gain new buyers. Young engineers learn how to operate, repair, and eventually design the systems themselves. Suddenly, the country is not only producing a crop, it is producing knowledge. And knowledge may be even more important than fuel, because a tank of fuel is consumed. Technical capability remains. A factory may eventually wear out, but a generation of trained engineers can build the next one. That is the difference between importing a solution and developing a capacity. And it leads to the next question. If Burkina Faso turns farms into energy assets, can it build a real industrial chain around them? Or will the dream of sovereignty collide with the hard realities of money, food security, infrastructure, and scale? But this is where the dream becomes difficult. Because sovereignty is not created by a speech. It is not created by a flag. And it is not created simply by rejecting outside money. Sovereignty has to work in the real world. It has to reach the farmer. It has to reach the engineer. It has to reach the family sitting at a market table calculating what food will cost next week. For a mother in Burkina Faso, energy sovereignty does not mean a geopolitical slogan. It means whether electricity stays on. It means whether transport becomes more expensive. It means whether food prices rise because fuel costs rise. It means whether her children can find meaningful work close to home. For an older farmer, sovereignty means something different. It means whether the land can still support the next generation, whether a son can remain in the village and build a future, whether a daughter can find work in a processing plant, a laboratory, a transport company, or a local business, instead of being forced to search for opportunities somewhere else. For a young African engineer, sovereignty may mean the chance to stop watching raw materials leave the country while finished products return at a higher price. This is the human center of the story, and it leads to one of the most important distinctions in modern Africa. Political independence can happen in a single historic moment. Economic sovereignty takes years, sometimes decades. A nation can raise its own flag quickly, but building power stations, roads, refineries, storage facilities, laboratories, transport networks, and skilled workforces takes patience. This is why the real test for Burkina Faso is not whether it can say no. The real test is what it builds after saying no. Imagine a biofuel processing site operating near an agricultural region. At sunrise, trucks begin arriving. Farmers unload crops. Workers inspect the material. Engineers monitor temperatures, pressure, and production. Mechanics move between machines. Drivers prepare fuel for transport. Small businesses appear around the facility. Restaurants, repair shops, transport contractors, storage services, equipment suppliers, a single industrial plant begins creating activity beyond its walls. That is the positive vision. But every part of that vision comes with risk. What happens if too much agricultural land is used for fuel instead of food? What happens if processing costs remain too high? What happens if the equipment depends entirely on imported parts? What happens if drought reduces crop production? What happens if the government spends heavily, but the project does not become commercially competitive? These are not reasons to abandon the idea. They are reasons to judge it carefully. Because economic sovereignty cannot mean replacing one dependency with another. Burkina Faso would need to prove that local production can improve lives without weakening food security. It would need to prove that farmers receive a fair share of the value. It would need to prove that young technicians are truly being trained. It would need to prove that local companies are participating. And it would need to prove that the system can survive without permanent emergency support. If it can do those things, then the significance of the project becomes much larger than fuel. Because Burkina Faso is not standing alone in the Sahel. Look at the map. Burkina Faso sits inside a region where countries are asking deeper questions about trade, security, resources, and political independence. Now imagine the idea spreading. Not the exact same biofuel project. The principle behind it. One country grows agricultural feedstock. Another produces equipment. Another develops storage and processing capacity. Road networks connect the markets. Regional energy flows across borders. Products are processed inside Africa before being exported. More value remains inside the region. Suddenly, the argument changes. The goal is no longer complete self-sufficiency. That would be unrealistic. The goal becomes strategic interdependence. African countries trading more with each other. African industries supplying each other. African governments negotiating with outside powers from a stronger position. That distinction matters. Because sovereignty does not have to mean isolation. Burkina Faso still needs global markets. It still needs technology. It still needs capital. It still needs partners. The question is whether those partnerships create capability inside Burkina Faso or simply create another permanent dependency. This may be one of the most misunderstood parts of the African sovereignty debate. The choice is not always between the West and isolation. It can be between two kinds of partnership. One model says, we provide the money, we provide the technology, we provide the management, you provide the raw material. The other model says, bring capital, bring technology, bring markets, but train our people, build here, process here, hire here, and allow more of the value to remain here, that second model could transform Africa's relationship with the world. And that is where Washington enters the story. How would the United States react if more African governments began demanding those terms? There are two possibilities. The first is resistance. Western companies and institutions could become concerned about new local ownership rules, stronger processing requirements, or governments demanding greater control over strategic industries. From their perspective, sudden policy changes can create risk. Investors want predictability. Businesses want clear rules. Lenders want confidence that agreements will be respected. Those concerns are real. But there is another possibility: adaptation. American companies could become equipment suppliers, technology partners, investors, engineering partners, buyers of African products, training partners. In that future, African sovereignty does not weaken American business. It changes the nature of the relationship. And that creates a fascinating contradiction. Americans understand the language of economic security very well. Americans talk about domestic manufacturing, energy independence, secure supply chains, supporting farmers, protecting strategic industries, bringing jobs home, reducing dangerous dependence on foreign suppliers. Those ideas are widely understood inside the United States. So here is the uncomfortable question. If those goals are legitimate for Americans, why should they become controversial when Africans pursue them? That does not mean every policy adopted in Burkina Faso will succeed. It does not mean every foreign agreement is unfair. And it does not mean every locally controlled project will automatically perform better. But it does mean Africa is increasingly asking for something more than assistance. It is asking for participation in the highest value parts of the economy. That is a major change. And if Burkina Faso proves that a different development model can work, the consequences could travel far beyond its borders. Imagine neighboring countries watching closely. They would not need to copy every policy. They would only need to ask the same question. Why export the crop before processing it? Why export the mineral before refining it? Why export the opportunity before creating the job? This is where a small project can become a large idea. And large ideas can move faster than governments expect. But there is one final warning. Pride cannot replace performance. A government can promise sovereignty. A leader can inspire millions. A nation can reject a major outside proposal. But eventually, the numbers matter. How much fuel is actually produced? At what cost? How many farmers benefit? How many jobs are created? How much foreign fuel is replaced? Does food remain affordable? Do local businesses grow? Do engineers gain real skills? Does the project survive 5 years later? Those are the questions that will decide whether Burkina Faso is building a new economic model or simply a powerful political story. And this is why the next few years matter so much. If the country can connect agriculture, energy, local processing, technical training, and regional trade, it could create something larger than a biofuel industry. It could create proof that African resources can generate more value inside Africa. Proof that international partnership does not require permanent dependency. Proof that a developing nation can demand better terms and still remain open to the world. Now return to the two farmers we met at the beginning. The American farmer wakes before sunrise because he wants his land to remain productive. He wants stable markets. He wants his children to inherit something valuable. He wants security. The farmer in Burkina Faso wakes for the same reason. He wants his land to feed his family. He wants better tools. He wants affordable energy. He wants his children to have opportunities. He wants security. The machinery may be different. The income may be different. The infrastructure may be different. But the human desire is not. That is why this story should not end as America against Africa. The deeper story is about what every nation eventually wants: the ability to make important choices for itself. For decades, one of the most common questions about Africa was simple: how much help does Africa need? But perhaps the question is changing. Perhaps the new question is this: how much value can Africa create for itself? If Burkina Faso succeeds, the most important result may not be the number of gallons of fuel produced. It may not be the size of a factory. It may not even be the amount of money saved on imports. The real transformation could be psychological. A farmer begins to see his crop as industrial power. An engineer begins to see a future at home. A family begins to believe that national resources can create national opportunity. And a government begins negotiating with the world from a different position. Not saying, help us survive, but saying, work with us while we build. That is a very different message. And it is one the world may hear more often in the years ahead. So perhaps the final question is not whether Burkina Faso should accept or reject outside aid. The real question is much larger. Is development measured by how much money a country receives, or by the day that country becomes strong enough to choose its own terms? And if Burkina Faso can prove that greater ownership, local process, and regional cooperation really improve the lives of ordinary people, then one final question remains: which African country will be next? if you believe the future of Africa should be judged by what its people can build, not simply by what they can receive, share your view in the comments. Do you believe Burkina Faso is taking a smart risk? Or is rejecting large foreign support too dangerous for a developing economy? There is no simple answer, but there is one principle worth remembering. Real sovereignty is not the absence of partners. It is the ability to choose them. May the people of Burkina Faso find wisdom in that choice. May African farmers, workers, engineers, and families gain more opportunity from the resources they already possess. And may cooperation between Africa, the United States, and the wider world become a partnership built on dignity, mutual benefit, and respect. Because if that happens, the rise of African economic sovereignty will not need to become a defeat for anyone. It could become the beginning of a stronger relationship for everyone.